"You don't belong in this family," my daughter-in-law said coldly at the holiday table. The words sliced through the room like shattered glass. For a second, everything froze. The crackle of the fireplace, the glow of the candles, even the quiet mountain wind outside the lodge near Aspen, Colorado. Everyone waited to see if I would do what I always did, lower my eyes and stay silent. My name is Margaret Hale, and at 79, they had already decided I was disposable. My son Ethan sat beside his wife Claire, gripping his wineglass as if it could hide him. He didn't defend me. He never did anymore. Claire, on the other hand, looked radiant. Perfect posture, perfect smile, perfectly cruel. "You really shouldn't host gatherings like this," she added gently, masking her insult as concern. "It's a lot for someone your age." I had spent the entire day cooking. My hands trembled from exhaustion, not weakness. Still, she spoke as if I were an obstacle standing in the way of her future. That's when I pushed my chair back. The sharp scrape against the stone floor echoed through the lodge. Heads snapped up. Claire blinked, startled. Ethan finally looked at me. They thought this was the moment I would apologize. Instead, I stood, smoothed my coat, and met her gaze. They had no idea this dinner wasn't the end of my patience. It was the beginning of their reckoning. No one spoke after I stood. The silence pressed down harder than any insult Claire had thrown at me. I could feel it. The discomfort, the confusion, the sudden fear that something had shifted and couldn't be pushed back into place. "This lodge is too much for you, Mom," Ethan finally said, his voice low, rehearsed. "Claire and I have been talking. Maybe it's time you considered other arrangements." There it was. Not concern, not love. Eviction, wrapped in polite words. Claire folded her hands, her red nails gleaming under the chandelier. "We found a beautiful senior residence near Denver. Full service, very exclusive. You'd be safer there." Safer, smaller, out of the way. I looked around the room. The stone walls, the long wooden table, the windows facing the snow-covered pines. My husband and I had bought this place 30 years ago, back when dreams were still shared and not measured in convenience. "This is my home," I said calmly. Claire smiled, thin and tight. "For now." That was when I realized this dinner wasn't about family at all. It was about control. They weren't waiting for me to grow old. They were waiting for me to disappear. And what neither of them knew was that I had planned for this moment decades ago. Later that night, I couldn't sleep. The lodge was quiet, but my mind wasn't. Claire's words replayed over and over, sharp and deliberate. "You don't belong in this family." She hadn't said it in anger. She had said it like a decision already made. I walked into the small study off the main hall, the room my husband Robert used to call our thinking room. The scent of old books and pine wood wrapped around me like a memory. That's when I realized something chilling. This wasn't sudden. The polite suggestions, the concern about my health, the way Claire had started answering my phone, sorting my mail, scheduling appointments I never asked for. It had been happening slowly, carefully. Ethan used to call me every day. Now he only spoke when Claire was nearby. He asked questions about my finances, my insurance, my will, always framed as worry. I sat down at the desk and opened the bottom drawer. Inside was a folder I hadn't touched in years. Contracts, old agreements, signatures I recognized instantly. Mine. Robert had insisted we prepare for every possibility. "Just in case," he used to say. I never thought this would be the reason. As I flipped through the papers, my hands stopped shaking. Claire thought I was weak. Ethan thought I was confused. But they had forgotten something very important. I didn't survive this long by accident. The next morning, Claire came alone. That alone told me everything. She arrived with coffee in hand and a smile carefully practiced in the mirror. Concerned, gentle, almost kind. The kind of kindness that feels like a trap. "I was worried about you after last night," she said, settling into the chair across from me without waiting for an invitation. "Ethan feels terrible. We both do." I said nothing. Silence had become my greatest advantage. She glanced around the lodge, her eyes measuring the space, calculating. "You know," she continued, "places like this can be dangerous in winter. Slippery floors, stairs. If something happened—" She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. "I've scheduled an appointment for you," Claire added, pulling a card from her purse. "A specialist. He makes house visits, very discreet." A specialist I hadn't asked for. That's when it clicked. They weren't just trying to move me. They were preparing to declare me unfit. If a doctor said I couldn't manage my own life, they wouldn't need my permission for anything else. I looked at her and smiled softly. "Thank you for your concern," I said. Her shoulders relaxed. She thought she was winning. The doctor arrived that afternoon. His name was Dr. Leonard Price, and he carried himself with the calm confidence of someone used to being believed. He shook my hand briefly, then spoke slowly, as if volume and patience could replace respect. "Margaret," he said, smiling, "do you know why I'm here today?" "Yes," I answered evenly. "Because my daughter-in-law asked you to be." Claire stood near the window, arms crossed, watching carefully. Dr. Price asked questions that sounded harmless, but weren't. What day was it? Did I ever forget names? Had I felt confused recently? Each question was another brick in a wall they were building around me. When I corrected him, precisely, calmly, his smile tightened. "Sometimes people don't notice their own decline," he said, glancing at Claire. "It's very common." That was the moment. I stood up. Not slowly, not carefully. I stood like someone who knew exactly who she was. "You are done here," I said. Dr. Price blinked. "Mrs. Hale, I'm only trying to help." "No," I interrupted. "You're trying to create a record, and you won't." I turned to Claire. "This meeting ends now. Any further conversations about my health will include my attorney." For the first time, fear flickered across her face, because the week-old woman she expected never showed up. That night, I went back to the study, not to hide, but to remember. I opened the old filing cabinet Robert and I had shared for decades. Most people would have seen clutter. I saw a map, dates, decisions, safeguards. At the very back was a slim leather folder, worn at the edges. Inside were documents Claire had never imagined existed. Ownership records, legal agreements, a majority stake placed carefully in my name years before my husband died. Not public, not advertised, protected. I sat there for a long time, letting the truth settle in. They weren't pushing me out of the family. They were trying to steal from the wrong woman. Robert had trusted me to know when the moment came, and now it had. I picked up the phone and dialed a number I hadn't used in years. "Jonathan Reed," a familiar voice answered. "It's Margaret Hale," I said calmly, "and I need you to come see me." There was a pause. Then, "I was wondering when you'd call." Jonathan Reed arrived the next morning, carrying a leather briefcase and the same sharp gaze I remembered from decades ago. He was older now, gray hair, deeper lines, but his mind was still ablade. We met in the study, no pleasantries, just business. I laid the documents on the desk in front of him, the ownership papers, the agreements Robert and I had signed, the proof that I wasn't just a widow living on inheritance. I was the majority shareholder. Jonathan studied each page carefully, his expression shifting from curiosity to something closer to admiration. "They have no idea," he said quietly. "No," I replied. "They don't." He leaned back in his chair. "What do you want to do, Margaret?" I didn't hesitate. I want them exposed. I want the truth told in front of everyone they're trying to impress. And I want my company back. Jonathan smiled, a thin, dangerous smile. "There's a charity gala next weekend," he said. "Claire's been planning it for months. She's hosting, high society, press, the perfect stage." "Then that's where we'll do it," I said. He nodded slowly. "This won't be subtle." "Good," I answered. "I'm done being quiet." The night of the gala arrived like a storm waiting to break. The Denver Art Museum ballroom glittered with crystal chandeliers and designer gowns. Claire stood at the center of it all, radiant in a champagne-colored dress, greeting guests as if she owned the world. In a way, she thought she did. I watched from across the room, dressed simply but elegantly. No one noticed me at first. That was intentional. Ethan stood beside her, stiff and uncomfortable in his tailored suit. He laughed at the right moments, shook the right hands, but his eyes kept darting toward the entrance. He knew something was wrong. He just didn't know what. Jonathan stood near the stage, calm and composed, waiting for his cue. We had rehearsed this carefully. Timing was everything. Claire took the podium to thunderous applause. She spoke about legacy, about giving back, about building a future. Her words were polished, rehearsed, empty. She thanked the donors. She thanked the board. She even mentioned Robert, my late husband, as if his memory belonged to her. That was when Jonathan stepped forward. He walked onto the stage with quiet authority, and the room fell silent. Claire's smile froze. "Ladies and gentlemen," Jonathan began, his voice cutting through the confusion. "I'm here tonight on behalf of Margaret Hale, the true founder and majority owner of Hale Industries." A collective gasp swept through the ballroom. Jonathan didn't wait for the shock to settle. "For the past 5 years," he continued, his voice steady and clear, "Hale Industries has been systematically drained by its current CEO, Ethan Hale, and his wife, Claire." The room erupted in whispers. Claire's face went pale. She tried to step forward to interrupt, but Jonathan raised a hand. "Funds have been funneled into offshore accounts, false consulting fees, fraudulent expenses, all documented." On cue, assistants moved through the crowd, handing sealed envelopes to key guests, board members, journalists, investors. Inside were copies of everything: bank records, wire transfers, the damning evidence Claire thought would never see the light of day. Ethan stood frozen, his face drained of color. Claire turned on him, her voice a hiss that carried across the silent room. "You said this was handled. You promised me." "I didn't know." Ethan stammered, but his voice cracked. "You're weak," Claire spat, her mask finally shattered. "This is your fault. All of it." The crowd watched in horrified fascination as the perfect couple tore each other apart. Then I stood, every head turned. I walked slowly to the stage, and the room parted for me. When I reached the podium, I looked directly at Claire. "You told me I didn't belong in this family," I said quietly. "You were right. I don't belong in yours. This was always mine." The legal consequences came swiftly. Within days, investigators from the Financial Crimes Division were at Claire and Ethan's door. The evidence was overwhelming. There was no room for denial. Ethan cooperated immediately, desperate to save himself. He testified against Claire, painting himself as manipulated, controlled. It was cowardly, but it was also the truth. Claire fought until the very end, but the numbers didn't lie. She was sentenced to 12 years. Ethan received 7. Their assets were frozen. The yacht, the penthouse, the designer wardrobe, all auctioned off. The life they'd built on stolen ground crumbled to dust. As for me, I returned to Hale Industries, not as a silent partner, but as its chairwoman. The board welcomed me back with a mixture of shock and respect. I restructured the company, brought in fresh leadership, and refocused on innovation and integrity, the values Robert and I had built it on. I also reached out to my granddaughter, Lily. She had been studying engineering in Boston, far from the chaos her parents created. When I told her the truth, she cried, not from shame, but from relief. "I always knew something was wrong," she said. "I just didn't know how to help you." Now she works beside me, brilliant, kind, everything her father could have been. I'm 80 years old now, and my life is fuller than it's been in decades. I learned that dignity isn't given, it's claimed, and silence, when mistaken for weakness, becomes the sharpest weapon of all.